is Friday, 5th of August. It's about 9:30 by now, and I'm speaking with Dr. Sam Talmadge. And tell me, Sam, McNeill Talmadge?
Right.
Of Athens, Georgia.
Right.
And Dr. Talmadge, would you tell me a little something of your experience during the World War II era?
Sure. I'd considered fairly conclusively in the summer prior to Pearl Harbor that war was approaching, and my closest friend and I both felt then that although we didn't care for the war, that we would be obligated to try to do what we could for those fellows that were more unfortunate in having to fight it. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, I sought to gain an entrance to the unit from the hospital which I trained in Boston, and I called a doctor there whom I knew would be the commandant of the general hospital that was composed of members primarily of the staff or graduates of the hospital. And much to my surprise, the secretary told me that he had been in England for some time and that the unit had been activated and was stationed in Camp Blanding, Florida. And as it turned out, I'm very happy that I wasn't assigned to it, because I stayed there in Florida for long after the invasion. And there was a good bit of distension that they finally divided the unit up into two parts. And I called next the executive officer of the group. Got his address, and he was a good friend of mine, and talked to him, and he said, I would advise you to volunteer as soon as you can. He said you don't want to wait and end up in a military medical training camp up at Carlisle Barracks or something like that. So he gave me the name of the chief of personnel, medical officers in Washington, and I called, made an appointment, went up to see him, and found out he was a good friend of a friend of mine up there. And he told me that there was a new general hospital that was going to open up in Atlanta shortly after the first of the year, and if I would like that I could very easily be appointed to join the service there, and accordingly would get orders for a physical examination and then orders when to report for duty. And as a result, I spent almost 2 years at Lawson on the surgical service, and it was a very pleasant experience. We were able to obtain a small cottage close by the hospital, which was a 2,000-bed hospital and well staffed. And I felt really that my experience there was just like getting 2 more years of residential training. And but when the first of the auxiliary surgical groups were staged there to go overseas, I became enamored with what their function was going to be, and discussed with the chief of surgery the possibility of getting a transfer to it. And he told me that they were already filled, and so I tried again when the third auxiliary staged there with the same success. They had long been filled. So I fortunately got in on the third of the auxiliaries that trained there, and we were shipped out to England in a large convoy, about 6 to 8 weeks prior to the invasion. We landed in, well, the trip over in the big convoy was very exciting. It was a tremendous convoy. It was so large we could never count the number of ships in it. We estimated that there must have been about 68, and included in it were the two battleships that later participated in the invasion, the Arkansas and Texas, and they were well protected. And all the way over, we were protected by a small type destroyer known as DE destroyers, and they were just scampering around the periphery of the convoy day and night, and very frequently we would see one stop and others congregate in the general area, and after a few minutes, or sometimes seconds, I guess, they'd start dropping these tremendous depth charges. What their results were, we never knew. Whether they ever destroyed a submarine or not, we never knew. And we had an uneventful and interesting trip over very, very crowded 9 rooms to a small 9 bunks to a small cabin, and we landed in Scotland, and our unit, which was approximately 425 men, was billeted in a delightful little English village up in the Cotswold Mountains, where we had to appear at breakfast time and have roll call and put through some pretty strenuous exercises by one of our members, who was an All-American center at Harvard, and he worked us. And we had road marches and did have some lectures from boys from the 3rd Hawks that had participated in North Africa and were returned to England, and they gave us some very good information. And also in our group was a young surgeon who had participated in the Spanish War as a surgeon. And out of his experience there, the field hospital was developed as an innovation. What was the arrangement for handling casualties in the First World War. Dr. Truetta, who wrote, who was chief of the medical military department, whatever they would have there, wrote the Bible of what we might call foreign surgery, and he based it on 2 premises. One, the immediate separation at either the battalion aid station or the clearing station of the so-called non-transportable casualties, which consisted of men with chest wounds and abdominal wounds and massive extremity wounds that were in shock. And the others were sent to a clearing station where men with relatively minor wounds were treated, and the bulk of the patients that were fairly severely wounded but not in bad condition were moved back to the evacuation hospitals, which were usually a number of miles back, 8 to 10 miles behind the field hospitals. And the field hospitals were designated by platoons, and initially a platoon was assigned to a combat area, but later in the war a platoon might be several platoons assigned in the same area, and each platoon consisted of teams of primarily of general surgeons, consisting of 2 surgeons, an assistant surgeon, who was usually a young man who had just finished his internship, and 2 medical technicians who were exceedingly well trained and could do most anything, on a and the nurses didn't come to France until about D+7. And these field hospitals were platoons, were divided into 3 hospitals, and they worked on a basis of what you might call leapfrogging each other. When one got filled up with patients, another one from the rear would advance beyond it, and having completed your surgical work at the field hospital, you'd leapfrog 2 up to the next hospital and thus follow the line of combat. And they were stationed at varying distances behind the line. The criterion was to place them where they were relatively safe. A lot of artillery fire came over us, but on one occasion a battery of heavy artillery was located too close to our field hospital, and the Germans were decent enough to send a message over that either the field hospital or the battery had to be moved because it would jeopardize a hospital if they're engaged in counter battery fire. But anyway, the patients were brought from the battalion aid station, or if they were in not too bad condition, went to the clearing station, which was usually as closely situated as possible to, or rather, we were closely situated as possible to the division clearing station. The field hospitals were extremely well equipped. They were for each had a capacity of 40 patients, cots and whatnot, a good staff that was totally independent of the surgical teams, and good equipment. We carried our own surgical instruments, and that's all that we carried. And at first, conditions were very primitive due to the fact that the craft that brought over the entire load of medical equipment was struck by shell fire as they were unloaded, and all of the equipment went up in smoke. And as a result, the first field hospital that was able to become operational was on about the 13th of June. The casualties were all severely wounded, and it had been learned that in World War I, the situation was totally different. They had first aid stations where the men were bandaged and splinted and whatnot, and then sent either by railway in lorries or trucks to what were called based hospitals. They were equivalent of a general hospital. They were all large hospitals set up in French hospitals as a rule. And they had found that about 90 to 95% of the men that we were received who were classified as non-transportables died before they reached the general hospital. And that was the prime basis for having what we call forward surgery, so that these men could sometimes receive definitive abdominal surgery and chest surgery within a half an hour of their wounding. We had a field hospital, in addition to its operating tent, had what was called a shock ward, where all the patients came, and those that were in shock were treated by a shock team that was provided with each medical group that was affiliated with a field hospital, and it consisted of a good young surgeon, a nurse, and two well-trained medical technicians, and there the patients were given blood, plasma, and oxygen, whatever supportive measures were necessary to prepare them to undergo surgery. And it was quite a place, and it was very well run. At the end of the war, or after the war, the statistics showed the fate of the severely wounded as regards recovery was almost the opposite from that World War I, that approximately 90% of the abdominal and chest wounds survived, and the massive multiple wounds combined, chest and abdominal and massive extensive extremity or bodily wounds, or survival rate was more nearly 85%. But there's no way of interpreting those statistics accurately, because one has to take into consideration that during that interval there were so many innovations in treatment, the advent of the tetanus immunization prior to entering combat, the use of plasma, whole blood, sulfonamides, penicillin, and improvements in certain techniques. So you can't make a comparison, but at any rate we felt that our results were very gratifying. And we worked first with a clearing station of the amphibious engineers, the men that were to clear the mines and make way for the landing of ships in their lanes. And 40% of them were killed early on D-Day, and some of them continued to work. I addressed one that I met shortly after we came ashore, and the beach was what you might describe best as just a tremendous junkyard. They were busy trying to, then had created, I think, 2 or 3 lanes that enabled troops and lighter vehicles to come ashore. And I asked him if he knew where the so-called beach master office was, who was to direct people to their proper destinations. And he laughingly said, well, if there ever was one, he never did get ashore, because I ain't seen a sign of a Red Cross since I've been here, except on the armbands of some of the first aid men. But fortunately, we met a runner coming down from above, and I stopped him and asked him if he knew of any hospital, and he said, I don't know what it is, but there's some sort of hospital just over the top up at the road you saw me come down. So we went up there, and it was a clearing station, and it had been taking care of all patients up until the night before we arrived. They established an exit road, and the original plan was for the casualties and the initial landings to be taken directly out to the landing ships for tanks. As soon as they evacuated the tanks, the the bottom deck, a hold, which was an enormous space, was converted into an operating room and beds, and they had on board the ships as they came over personnel to take care of the patients. But that didn't work out nearly as well as planned. I never did know how many were evacuated. They had several teams of surgeons from the 3rd Auxiliary Group attached to them, but I met a member of that group whom I knew on sight, but not very well, and I asked him what had been taking place, and he said as far as he was concerned, nothing. That their team was kept aboard, no patients were brought out while he was there, and that all of the tanks of the 3 tank carriers were put out of commission before they went into action. Percent of the tanks that were equipped with the water wings, these huge inflatable canvas wings that were designed by the British to keep a tank afloat for a short distance. But it turned out, in retrospect, that the only time that we had tried that type of tank was down off of a very sandy beach and under calm conditions. But on D-Day, and even to a great extent on D+1, the seas were still very rough, and these tanks immediately sank, and the 6 members of the crew were in a steel coffin, and the 3rd tank elected not to use the wings and carried his tanks in directly, and they were destroyed just as fast as they came off. Only 2 ever got out on the beach, and they were promptly put out of action. So, according to this boy, the ship that he was on was ordered to return immediately to England to bring another load of tanks, and he hadn't done anything, he said, but sit over there, and when he found out the ship was going back, he caught a ride and came ashore. I never saw him afterwards. But we stayed quite busy at the clearing station at first, and had practically no equipment. The clearing station just had first aid. The clearing station had just basic supplies, but fortunately had some ether and alcohol and plenty of towels and soap. We had no gloves, any surgical equipment, and the few cases that we did there, everything was improvised by our technicians. They were very ingenious. The patients were operated upon on the litter that they were brought in on, and which was placed on a stack of empty crates to get them at the right height, and they fashioned lighting for us out of mounting electric bulbs and tin cans for reflectors, and we managed to work out fairly well. But I guess the second day there, which would have been D3, the clearing station was ordered to change its function and become the headquarters for air evacuation of patients. And already bulldozers had begun clearing a landing strip adjacent to it. And he told us that there were no field hospitals in yet, and asked us if we could stay and help them organize his evacuation program, which we were happy to do. And as I remember, it was either +4 or D+5 that we sent out our first load of patients to England. And we remained there with them until the first field hospital came, which was the 13th field hospital, which was stationed about 3 miles inland. And from that point on, we stayed with the 29th Division all the way through the Sanlo campaign and the breakout, and were transferred to another corps and functioned in the vicinity of Sanlo at the base of the Brittany Peninsula, and from there we went to the Brest, where there was a siege that lasted almost 4 weeks, and we had an abundance of casualties there.
Who commanded the 29th Division, do you remember?
Yes, they were very unfortunate, and one of my friends in Athens asked me what division I was associated with most, and I told him the 29th, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry for you, that was one of the sorest divisions in the war." And I replied to him that their excellent commanding officer, General Leonard Giroux, who had organized them overseas and was greatly admired and beloved, was just before the invasion promoted to command the second in command to Eisenhower, and represented Eisenhower at Omaha. So the 29th lost him and was replaced by a general who in my opinion had more fortitude than he had military skill, according to what the soldiers said. But there again, the 29th had tremendous casualty loss in that first wave, and that was made all the more disastrous in it on the landing craft, which were flat-bottom vessels that would carry 35 or 40 men, would run up as far as it could on the beach, and the fore end of the landing crafts was rectangular and was constructed of a single large ramp, which they lowered for the men and vehicles to go off of. When excuse me.
Water?
Beg pardon?
Would you like water?
No, thank you.
All right, sir.
It was, of course, necessary for the first men in the unit, in the group, to be in the forefront of the landing craft, and so the field grade officers, and probably even more importantly the high echelon of the non-commissioned officers, were the first to step off of the landing craft, and virtually all of them were killed, severely wounded. So what was left was mostly a bunch of privates, corporals, and lower grade sergeants that, without leadership, and suffered casualties likewise, but not severe. And many managed to crawl to what was known as a shingle. It was an accumulation of almost vertical accumulation of pebbles that the waves had washed up and had formed a sort of wall. And if they could reach it at high tide at that particular area, the water came up to almost 25 feet from the shingle. But the landing craft never completely reached shore. Many of the men were let off over their heads, and even when we let off in water that was almost waist high and had to wade in which made ideal targets for the machine gunners that were invisible on the cliffs. But about 9 o'clock after the hour, which was 6:30 in the morning, the second in command of the 29th Division, Major General Coda, who was known as Dutch Coda and was a legendary figure, came ashore, and he was the commanding officer of one of the battalions of the 1st Infantry, which was the other assaulting division of the two. Colonel Canham, with just total disregard of their safety, walked up and down the beach and told the fellows that they had their choice. They could lie there where they were and get killed, or they could take a chance of surviving by crawling up against the shingle and joining other men. And they finally were able to assemble groups of men, but the terrain from the beach up to the top was heavily mined, and at the back of it had 3 rows of so-called concertina wire stretched across, and anti-personnel mines were attached to it that would explode when one got entangled in it. But one group were able to obtain what was called a Bangalore torpedo, which consisted of a series of pipe sections of a diameter of, I'd say, 2.5 inches. And they would run a detonator wire through several sections of this, and then in the foremost section they'd place a large explosive, and they could still lie on the belly and push these things up underneath the wire. And in addition to blowing the wire up, they would detonate the mines at that particular area, so these men could gradually move up. But after they got beyond the point at which they were able to use the Bangalores, they had no mine detectors. None reached shore, and they had to crawl the way up on their bellies, probing as the leaders went with their knives or bayonets for buried mines, and dig them up and mark little lanes with passes. And one battalion, and a friend of mine was in that battalion. He was an Athenian and now lives in Atlanta. And he was with that battalion.
What's his name?
I wish you hadn't asked me.
Maybe later.
I'll think of it later, but he was a patient of mine. And I finally reached him when the newspapers were planning their program, which didn't materialize very well, in my opinion. I located him in Marietta, Georgia. One of his sons who lived near Athens, I recognized his name from the telephone book, and he wrote me a very nice letter, 2 pages. He taught at the university and was a fine writer. but for some reason the paper did not print his letter, which I was rather indignant over. But anyway, once our men got to the top of the cliffs, they found a series of trenches, and these trenches all connected to the casemated heavy artillery, the 88s and mortar pits and whatnot that had been impregnable from fire from below. And the Germans that were managing those trenches were a mixture of prisoners of war that had elected to serve in the German army rather than remain in a prison camp, and Polish and Czech and whatnot. And they ran. They didn't stand and fight. And of course the guns were manned by excellent artillery. But it enabled our soldiers to approach the casemated guns, and they would slip around to the gun slit where there was a narrow opening for the gun and pull the pin on a hand grenade and hold it for what they knew to be the proper length of seconds and then toss it in the casemate, and it would kill every man in it. And they systematically eradicated the big guns that way. More and more troops began to follow them and come up, and soon very few remained active. And as a result, we were able to get up by later in the day quite a number of troops. But one of the things that was awfully difficult to explain was the fact that a very good German division had been stationed directly behind that area of the beach some 6 weeks prior to the invasion, and we never were aware of their presence. There was one story that a French patriot, at risk of life, sent out a message by a carrier pigeon, and the pigeon was shot down by machine gun fire. The official excuse that we gave, the government gave out, was that the Germans had such tight security in that area that it was very difficult to have an agent at work, but that they did have one good agent. But at that time he was on the west coast of the Citation Peninsula, and he knew nothing of the Germans there. So our fierce fighting began immediately after we got ashore, got up on the cliffs. And for some reason that I've never read any explanation of, that the troops that were designated to carry out the initial assault were never apprised of these trench hedgerows in Normandy, and they were trained out in flat country. And the Normans, being farmers for centuries, had outlined the boundaries of their farms by piling up the rocks that they plowed up in preparation of the soil. And as a result, the terrain of that part of Normandy consisted of relatively small farms of maybe 2 or 3 acres, and every one of them was surrounded by these hedgerows. And my son, who visited Normandy after the war, told me that the farmers there every spring pruned back the shrubs that grew up in the hedgerows in order to enhance the growth of roots and more firmly establish the hedgerows. So they were in themselves totally impenetrable. And the Germans had only to conceal an 88 gun at a distal end of a hedgerow and they could control it. We couldn't get through. And these men had had no experience with that type of warfare, far worse than were in the Civil War, even in World War II. Finally, one of our sergeants ingeniously devised an attachment to put on the hedgerow, which you could construct from the steel railroad rails that they had used to make their subterranean obstacles off the beach. They could salvage them and brought them up, and he devised some prongs from them that were pointed and attached to the front end of tanks. And at times they could push an opening through the tanks, but if they were exceedingly dense with rocks, they would at least make holes, and they would pack explosives in those holes and blow their way through. And once we could get through, we could get a gun mounted and take out the enemy. But we had to fight from field to field all the way down to San Lo, and it took so long to reach that city. And looking back at the history of Omaha beachhead, the maps of the campaign as planned had the objective for midnight of the outskirts of San Lo, but San Lo was not captured until the 18th of July, and the Lord only knows how many men were lost in that campaign. But the Germans finally withdrew, but the lower boundary of the town was the Veer River, and they set up a strong line of defense on the opposite side of it. Even though we finally captured the town, the Germans were able to give us a rough time.
Well, most of that time you had spent operating.
And all the time we followed the progress of the various battalions of the 29th Division through that whole time, and our tents stayed filled with casualties the whole time, and many of them severe because the weapons that really were most destructive. Of course, many men were killed by single shots from rifles and machine guns, but the men that survived a severe wounding were victims of mortar fire, which were highly explosive bomb-type missiles that were fired from a simple tube-like gun called a mortar, and they were fired up at a considerable height, and but were extremely accurate. They knew how to calibrate them so that they could have their gun mortar behind a hedgerow and very accurately drop one of these heavy explosives. And upon detonation, they became fragmented, and these red-hot pieces of brittle steel just flew out everywhere, and they were devilish devil weapons, and men were hit by mortar fire. If they were not killed, they received multiple wounds which involved considerable destruction of bodily tissues and fractured bones. And the Germans, I'm sorry to say, had far superior weapons to the Americans and British. Their tanks were more heavily armored, and they carried, the large ones carried these 88 caliber rifles, which were totally devastating. They fired at a long range and were extremely accurate. Our tanks were much lighter, and the Germans sardonically referred to them as Ronsons because they blew up so easily by being lighted. And our guns were, although we improved them and enlarged them up to a 90 millimeter gun, was still not comparable to the German 88. But we had one advantage in our tanks in that our main gun could be moved very readily, both horizontally and transversely. The heavily armored German tanks could change the elevation of their guns in horizontal movement, but they could not traverse them. If they had to move towards a target that was lateral to their orientation, they had to move the entire tank in order to fire on it. And I think General Abrams, who was Patton's deputy commander and later became commander-in-chief of the forces, I think in Vietnam. Creighton Able, yes. Was a great advocate of using flanking maneuvers. And if we were aware of the fact that the Germans were well entrenched in front of us, instead of trying to assault them, we'd withdraw and come in around their flanks and attack them from the rear, and it would prove to be very effective. But at first, some of the generals elected not to do that. And there's a story, and I have no reason to doubt it, written by a good author who was a member of one of the artillery outfits, one of the armored divisions who came in with the 7th Army from Marseille. The first time they went into action, the Germans were well entrenched across a small stream, and there was a field in front of the woods in which we were located. And fortunately, one of the corps commanders sent Major Abrams at that time over to talk to these boys who were going into combat for the first time, and he stressed that point that we should never make the mistake of attacking head-on with a German armor, that it was just suicidal. And the general of that division, according to this story, and it's in a well-accepted book, stood by and listened to it, and finally he dismissed Abrams and said, "I think you've given us enough advice. Appreciate you." So Abrams departed, and a day or two later we entered battle, and we went at them head on. And our tanks, the young commander of one tank battalion pled with the general not to send him out there. He was, according to the book, was a brilliant young West Pointer, and he told him that he was sure that it'd be suicidal, and this general told him that he was in charge of that division. And the author of the book witnessed this man. He led his battalion out, and he had only gone a short way before his head was just taken right off by a German 88. And according to this general, was sent back to the United States in about a week and reduced to the rank of buck private. I can't vouch for the rest of it, but I have no reason to disbelieve it.
Did you ever meet some of those characters in command?
Yes, I did, unfortunately. I met General Patton twice, one day. We were at pretty much a standstill during a period when there was a gasoline shortage, and our group was still part of the First Army, and we were billeted in the French city of Toul, and some 10 or 12 miles from Toul, the headquarters of the Third Army, which was Patton's army, had allegedly had their headquarters there. And while in the desert campaign in North Africa, among many of his rules, it did that under no circumstances was a vehicle to travel with the top up, that they got to keep that top down at all times so that any German planes coming in would be sighted. Well, one day we elected to go over and see some of our friends who were in Nancy, and we obtained a Jeep and a sergeant to drive us over there, and it was pouring down rain, and we had to top up to the Jeep, and there were 3 of us plus the Jeep driver, and we'd gotten almost to Nancy when we heard a siren coming from the rear, and we were very suddenly shoved off the road by a tank, by a Jeep with a 3-star flag flying on its hood, and he came out and in typical Patton-esque language made it very clear to us that we were in their territory and we had no vehicles were allowed to drive with their tops up. Right back of him, old Patton was sitting in a command car, ramrod straight, and wearing, no doubt, a Burberry raincoat, and he never looked to one side or another. He just stood sat perfectly stolid while this young man delivered his oration to us. And also he charged us with driving with 4 men in a Jeep. That in the Third Army they would never, for some reason, did not allow a Jeep to carry more than a driver and 2 passengers. There were some regulations among the others that Patton rigidly enforced throughout the war on his men, such as wearing their neckties into combat and never leaving off their leggings and things like that, which were perfectly ridiculous in the conditions we were fighting under. But also I was also came very closely to being victimized by a shell that was designated for Patton. Now, we were transferred to the Third Army shortly thereafter, and were billeted in a French hospital which was being cleaned up for use for an American evacuation hospital. It was a lovely hospital with tile floors and nice laboratory facilities, and it was the first time we'd been indoors since the war started. We'd slept in pup tents if we slept at all, and we hit the sack immediately after supper that night to enjoy the luxury of a cot with a mattress on it. And during the night we were awakened by a heavy thud, but we never heard anything more and went back to sleep. Next morning, much to our surprise, when we got out, there was for a reason I'd never heard any explanation, a British bomb disposal crew had erected a heavy tripod over a huge crater about 20 to 30 feet from the wall of the hospital in the vicinity of where we were. And we watched them as they very gingerly extracted this huge shell, and they had not exploded. And after they removed the detonator from the tip, it had been dislodged and was rendered harmless. And one of the members of the disposal crew told us that was not too uncommon, that there were so many slave workers working in munitions plants there under strict scrutiny, but somehow occasionally would manage to render a detonator inactive, and at times would scribble a little note of good luck in it before sealing it. The story back of that was that there was a rumor that Patton left his headquarters, which were always in a tent, every night, and enjoyed the luxury of bedding down for the night in one of the nice hotels in Nancy, and that this railroad gun on the other side of the Moselle River, which we were never able to find at that time, on a rainy night when the muzzle flash couldn't be detected, would lob one or two shells, I guess pretty much at random, into the city, hoping to hit his headquarters. And I guess they assumed that he might have been in that nice building we were in. But none of them ever damaged Patton. It was long after we had finally crossed the Moselle, and we located the railroad gun near the little town of Pont-à-Mousson, which was some 10 miles down the river from Nancy, and it was in an old abandoned railroad tunnel, and I don't know whether they pushed it out manually or with a little rail worker's car, but on these nights they'd push it to the entrance of the cave and fire a shell and then rapidly withdraw it, and it was totally invisible until it was captured. But there again, I think the Buckeye that I picked up after I went to North pocket throughout the war probably served me well. But we were very happy that it had sabotage. Those were the only encounters I had with any of the high brass. I don't recall seeing any of them personally. Occasionally we'd see a high-ranking medical officer come by a hospital and pay us a brief visit. And many of them were enjoyable, some of them were ridiculous. But we continued to work in the field hospitals throughout the war. We went from San Lo over to a battle that was really over when we got there, not far from the city of San Melo at the base of the Catenton Peninsula. And from there we were transferred up to Brest, where there was a siege, a rather lengthy one, capturing the fortress there. And from there we came back and were reassigned to the French 2nd Armored Division, which was sent down to near the Vosges Mountains in southern France. And there they were just holding a front along the upper Moselle River, awaiting the arrival of the 7th Army, which was coming up from Marseille. And we had a very pleasant stay there, very little work. Our work consisted of Frenchmen who allegedly were out on patrol at night, and I'm not sure what they were patrolling for, but I'm not sure it was all connected with their assignment. The Germans would slip over. We were there during a rainy spell, which was pretty typical, I gathered. Would slip over at night and plant anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in muddy roads and paths. So we did have quite a few casualties that fell victim to those deeds.
What month would this have been of 1944? In the September, say?
No, it was after September. We were at Brest until, I think, we left Brest on the 18th of September. And I would say that we were down there the latter part of September, early October. I did have another experience that I have to give credit to my Buckeye for. While we were down there, there was a farming area where a hospital was set up, and had a delightful French doctor who was in charge of the surgeon for the battalion. Was now an area of French, and he had practiced in Strasbourg, and told us we ever came there after the war to be sure and visited me, that he had an intact cellar of vintage wine, and he would wine and dine us. And one afternoon when it wasn't raining and we had nothing to do, my fellow surgeon and I decided to take a little walk. And we happened to notice that, well, our hospital was situated behind a low hill from the river. We noticed a French farmer plowing on the hilltop. So we strolled up there, and my companion spoke French quite well. And we always armed ourselves with some cigarettes whenever we anticipated encountering a Frenchman, and bartered with him successfully for some of his carrots up there on the hilltop, his potatoes. And after he told us to help ourselves, he returned to his plow, and when he reached the far end of the row, the German 88 guns had a very terrifying sound. The speed of their missiles exceeded the speed of sound, so the missile would arrive with this weird screech, and the muzzle blast would follow it. And we hadn't been free from the farmer very long before one of them kicked up a little dust right in front of us, some 20 feet away, and apparently didn't enough contact with the soil to detonate it, or else it was firing at such a horizontal trajectory that the point of the missile didn't even strike the ground, and the belly of the shell hit it, because we could hear it willow-walling on the other side and exploding eventually. And those rascals fired 4 shots with that 88 at 2 soldiers. By the time the second shot came over, neither of us recalled how we got on the lee side of the hill, whether we burned or crawled, but it was a pretty close call. Those are the only really situations that I was in that were endangering at all. We were in buildings where we had hospitals at many times struck by fragments of shells that were exploding at a distance. And the first night, and I think the second night too, in Normandy, there was very intense anti-aircraft fire from our ships offshore. The Germans were trying to get in and drop some bombs on the ships. It was beautiful to watch it if you had an opportunity to see the fireworks, if you could disregard what their significance was. But as we worked at night, the fragments from our anti-aircraft fire would have to come back to Earth, and frequently fragments of it would come through the wall of the tent and slash it. One time that happened, we had an eager beaver that happened to be on hand, so he quickly ran over and picked up the fragment for a souvenir, and he wasn't aware of the fact that those things were red hot, stuck to his hand.
That must have hurt. Would you show off some of the portraits you brought with you?
Yes, I'd be delighted to.
The book's title seems to be Men Without Guns.
Men Without Guns, and the preparation of this book was commissioned by the Abbott Company for presentation to the Surgeon General, and in preparation of it, they selected, as I recall, some 15 talented artists, and each of whom was assigned to a particular area of operation. And it begins with the theater in Normandy and Italy and Sicily, and the book is really dedicated to the men who probably got the least credit of any of the combatants in the war, who were the so-called corpsmen.
Today is August the 5th, and I'm speaking with Dr. Sam Talmadge, and this is part 2. It's approximately 10:30 in the morning, maybe close to 11, and he's just opened a book he's brought with him called Men Without Guns. And you were explaining to me what a corpsman was.
Yes. The corpsmen were members of the medical division, or rather medical corps, that were well trained in administration of first aid and followed very closely with the troops. And their only protection was about a 4-inch brassard bearing a red cross on their left arm, and a similar cross would be painted on the front of their helmets. And in my opinion, the artist that did the section on Normandy, who stayed at one of our sites for a couple of nights, and was a very fine young man from Boston. I think probably painted the finest of the most accurate pictures of all of the contributors to this volume, which I was fortunately able to obtain shortly after the war. I don't know whether it ever appeared on the market or not, but I've treasured it over the years for the artwork in it.
Right, 1945.
Yes.
The Blakiston Company.
Right.
Text by DeWitt Mackenzie. Descriptive captions by Major Clarence Worden. And forward by Major General Norman T. Kirk.
So this particular picture was made by, or drawn, painted by Lawrence Bell Smith, and it's a perfect depiction of the appearance of a battalion aid man, probably outside of their station. But these boys, many of them were killed, as oftentimes they'd hear a man in an open field screaming in pain, and they just couldn't resist going out there to at least give him some morphine or do what he could to relieve him. As a result, a number of them were killed by snipers. And I think all of the men that worked with the various components of the Army were greatly impressed by these young men who, seemingly, as far as publicity was concerned, were totally overlooked in the war. And every one of them was really deserving an award of honor for his bravery in performing the type of duty that he did.
Did you serve in that capacity, or did you work with those corpsmen?
No, the only time we ever had contact with them was when occasionally a man would be so severely wounded that they had a jeep close by that maybe a couple of them would accompany the patient to the field hospital, and that's the only time we ever saw them. And this picture here is a good representation of the appearance of those heroic young men.
So they rarely came back to the hospital, to the field hospital?
They returned immediately. They hurried back and went right back into their assignment. They are also, as shown in this book, you might delay a second until I find it. I thought I had it marked. This picture was also painted by Lawrence Bell Smith, who was with our outfit temporarily. And he stated that after this field hospital was first set up and he visited it, that shortly after he left, that they were compelled to withdraw, that the Germans had broken through, and they had to abandon the station, but several hours later returned to it. There's also another picture in here that I think is a very good representation of some of the scenes of the campaign in Normandy. And here again, Smith very accurately depicts three wounded men that are being rushed back to a field hospital by jeep. And he included in this picture a cow, which was a common sight in Normandy, for unfortunately our initial naval aerial bombardment prior to the invasion discharged their bombs and their shell fire further inland for fear of hitting the landing troops, and by delaying their bombing by a matter of 60 seconds, their bombs killed far more French farmers and their cattle than they did Germans. And here Smith includes in this painting one of the victims of gunfire, which could have been American or German. I have no way of knowing. But all of these pictures are very well done, and have several pages written about the circumstances of the location of their artwork, and contain some of the little known and most difficult medical services, such as Stilwell's campaign in Burma, and the hardships there where there were no roads, and hospital equipment as well as patients had to be carried by men out for some great distances at time to get them to a vehicle of some sort. Of course, that was before the advent of helicopter and warfare. They did utilize small planes occasionally if they found a valley that was fairly well protected, and supplies would be brought into that by air. Unfortunately, there are no pictures in here of the war in the Philippines.
Well, let's come back to your own experience. As Paris was liberated, can you tell me where you were then, or
yes,
at the end of the war?
We were returning from Brest, and the army was well past Paris. I think Paris had been liberated probably two weeks before our arrival, and we were temporarily stationed again in a fine hospital. It turned out to be the hospital where General Rommel had been treated when he had incurred an accident in a vehicle. This hospital was located in Versailles, one of the very prominent suburbs of Paris, such as Versailles, and the little town there was La Maisonneuve. And there again, a very freakish occurrence was experienced by my companion and me. We were given, as I mentioned, a 2-day, on 2 consecutive days to go in, to be taken into Paris by a truck, and we were pass would expire at 6 o'clock, at which time we were to be at the Arc de Triomphe, where we would be picked up. And the first afternoon we went there. We visited all the shops, which were, for all practical purposes, excuse me, barren from the German occupation of Paris, and what little had been honored by our troops who had previously passed through Paris. We found a few souvenirs, and the prized one that I was able to pick up was a very unique silver baby spoon from Cartier's, which I brought home to my, at that time, unborn son. While we were waiting at a few minutes before 6 on our first day, a small French car, probably a Renault, stopped and asked if he could give us a ride anywhere in perfect English. And so we told him that we were waiting a bus to return to where we were bivouacked in WWII. He said, "Well, that's quite a coincidence. That's where my home is." And I said, I'll be delighted to take you back." So he crowded the two of us in this little car, and we began conversing, and found out that shortly after my days at Harvard, that this boy had received his degree over at Harvard College. And so he invited us to have dinner at his home the following night, and would pick us up at the same place. And of course we very happily accepted the invitation, and he picked us up and carried us out. And his father was obviously had been, and still must have been, a successful merchant in Paris, and had been allowed to remain there during the occupation by the Germans. And his family made quite an affair out of this. We had always maintained very good relations with our mess sergeant, so we were able to obtain from him a few groceries that were scarcities in Paris, namely coffee and sugar and several other items. We carried a couple of bags out to his home as we went that night. And in turn, why, they treated us elegantly. They had invited the mayor of WWII in to join us for dinner that night, and although the rations were very limited in Paris, they were very proud to serve us apple pie as dessert. But better still than the food was the beverage that was accorded us.
French wine?
French wine, liqueurs, and they opened 2 magnums of champagne that night. So it was very fortunate that we had transportation to carry us back to camp after our stay. I obtained the address of this boy and exchanged letters with him a couple of times after the war, and then after that my letters were always returned. And 2 of my children have visited Paris several times since the war, and have been unable to locate this family. He brought a friend with him, and we also were never able to contact him. Oh, I still have his personal business card in my files, but there are things like that that I think most of us encountered during the war that broke the routine. In that respect, I'm quite sure from reading a very fine account of the experiences of Dr. Luther Wolfe, who was with the 2nd Auxiliary Group in Italy. Of course, they had their hard times, and particularly in the Winter War in the mountains, where the men of his group were there at the bombardment of Monte Cassino, and but their fighting was very irregular, and they had periods where they were given week-long passes into town, and in my opinion, as I may have mentioned, I think that the 2nd Auxiliary Group was by far the best organized of all of our groups. And at the end of the war, well, at the beginning of their experience in combat, which began with their landing at Anzio. Prior to that, their excellent commanding officer, General 4C, who was a prominent surgeon in the Army prior to the war, made up some forms that were distributed to all of the surgical teams to be filled out on every patient, and periodically were forwarded to his office. And at the end of the war, they were all assembled, and Major Wolfe, who had distinguished himself in battle there, and was placed in charge and commissioned to select several members of the group to devote several weeks to analyzing all of their figures and incorporating them in a book, which was finally placed in the library in the Surgeon General's office, and which I mentioned as citing what a fine commander they had. Our last consultant when I was with the 5th Auxiliary Surgical Unit happened to be at that time Colonel Michael DeBakey, one of the pioneers of heart surgery in Texas, and he met with us a number of times and would spend the night with us, and always brought us a bottle of scotch or something like that, and we'd have a delightful talk with him. So there were a lot of good men in the Army, and a lot of very bad eggs. There was one surgeon that was so atrocious that my companion and I up at Brest talked to the colonel of the Italian medical division of that we were associated with, and he arranged for us to meet the commander of the medical corps for that entire corps, which consisted of several divisions, and provided us transportation over there. And he was very sympathetic with our what we told him, and said that there was nothing that he could do directly, and that in order to do what was the proper thing would be to prefer charges against this man. He said that would be rather disastrous as far as you two are concerned, and probably many of you men of your detachment, because you'd have to appear as witnesses and you might have to be out of your action for several weeks, and we're busy and we need your men. And said, I'll keep a close watch on this man. He was a lieutenant colonel, and the thing that enraged us so was that when we were sent to Brest, we were hurriedly moved, and we arrived there with only the material that we had left over from our last stand, and much of our surgery was abdominal surgery, and handling abdominal wounds. It was a very vital adjunct to the surgery that a so-called vein tube, which was a long hollow rubber tube that was inserted through the patient's nose to keep his stomach decompressed for the first few days after surgery. And when we called for a second one night, the major in charge of our platoon said, "That's the only one we have, and we have no transportation." Said the colonel came and took our supply truck, and we haven't seen it since. But we had a very vigilant sergeant on our team who had been a former racetrack bookie in civil life, and a splendid technician. But he found out by investigating that truck one night when the colonel stopped by that it contained a baby grand piano, as well as a number of very valuable pieces of china and souvenirs. And we found that this man continued that throughout the war. But what we were mad about was that what we were having to do until we were able to get a truck to go to the supply depot, which was quite a distance from Brest. We were having to use this single tube for 1 hour at a time per patient. And in the interim, we'd remove it and cleanse it and insert it in another patient, which is a very unpleasant procedure, and should have remained in place at all times during at least the first or second day of surgery on these troops, and were infuriated over it. And our last experience with him was when we were sent to a town near the Elbe River, which was our last stand, and we were told before we left for that destination that we were going to be working in a hospital that would be set up in a very nice factory there. And when we arrived, we found a sign on the door, off limits to all, and this lieutenant colonel's name under it. And he was a very dominant character in a way, and yet I'm sure underneath a coward. But our hospital commander, who was a major, had to obey the orders, and he relocated us in really a better facility, which was a evacuated schoolhouse. And we found many interesting books there. I brought back a German atlas, which I still have, and there were typewriters there which we could use, and I guess our best find was a nice little photographic laboratory. My anesthesiologist was a very good photographer, and he utilized it and took a lot of pictures, but unfortunately we never did get any. He said he was going to send them. He did, after the war, pay me a visit and brought his pictures with him and showed them. But that's the last I ever saw of them. And like everyone else, our trunks, footlockers were pilfered, either en route or immediately after arriving in England, and the top drawer of every one had been pillaged, and my camera was among my losses, and it was almost impossible to find a decent camera over there. So what few pictures I have of very poor quality and not many of them. But we learned that there again, with the help of the first sergeant of that platoon, he took over our supply truck, and we had other trucks then. We were not totally dependent on that particular truck, and we're not too far from a medical supply depot. So we really had no problem as a result of it. But the factory that he had placed off limits was a soap factory. And it was well known that soap was one of the most precious commodities in Paris. And he and this man made innumerable round trips from way up in the northeastern portion of Germany to Paris, round trip, with loads of soap, which he sold on the black market. Several years after the war, this same companion of mine revisited Paris, and he made a point of tracking down this man. And he found that he was already a multimillionaire, owned a great deal of real estate, and was very prominent in business circles. And he didn't meet him, but he told me about what he found out about him. But I cite him as an example that we had both good and bad personnel in the Army, which is to be expected, I imagine.
Would you tell me a little bit more about the drive toward Berlin?
I know nothing of it. I had
how much longer were you in the European theater there?
Until the end of the war. Mm-hmm. We were the farthest station. Our hospital was situated a short distance from the Elbe River, which was a demarcation between the American and Russian zone, and also we were directly adjacent to the southernmost portion of the sector of the British Army. So we got to know them quite well, and we ended up the war there.
That would have been how long stationed at Elbe? How long was the hospital at Elbe? Several months?
No, I would say more nearly 3 to 4 weeks. There was very little fighting. When we arrived there, we dealt with some wounded and quite a few traffic accidents. And we're not particularly busy. While we were there, we received word that a slave labor camp that had been situated on a huge farm some 25 kilometers south of us had been apprehended by a forward group of armed cavalry unit, and that these men were probably 40 or 50 in number, I assume, labored on this immense farm. There was a big valley there, and they mainly grew beets, which were widely grown in Germany as a source of sugar, cabbage and potatoes. And they were housed in a single large brick barn, which had only one entrance. That was a pair of very heavy doors in which they could back a wagon to load it with hay or bring in things for storage. And all that was in there was a sizable quantity of hay, and these prisoners had pushed it up against the walls for their beds that they could burrow into in cold weather. They had nothing else for protection except the flimsy, striped garments that they were issued. They were heavily guarded at work, and if they were ever caught eating any of their vegetables, they were shot. And occasionally for minor infractions, there were at roll call in the morning, the victim would be brought out in front of the men and severely beaten. When the word of the approaching Americans reached them, they tried to destroy the evidence of their criminality, and they herded all these men up in that barn, poured gasoline on the floors, ignited it, locked the doors, and stationed a machine gun in front of it, and so no one could escape. But one man managed to escape. He was a very small Polish man who had been a prisoner of the Germans since the onslaught of Poland several years prior to that. And over a long period of time, he had used a piece of a broken farm implement as a pry bar, and he kept it concealed in his hay. And at night, after all the other inmates were asleep, he'd work a little bit on loosening one of the heavy boards that happened to be rather short in where his bed was, so that by this time he had that board completely loosened, and but with the nails in it, but easily removable. And due to his size, he was a very small man, he immediately got that board up and got out the rear of the camp. When the cavalry arrived there, due to lack of oxygen, the fire that had been ignited became exhausted fairly early from lack of oxygen. So their mission wasn't accomplished. These men were not consumed in the fire, but were all dead and badly burned. And I was on duty that particular time, but we had another man in the camp that was a very able anesthesiologist, so I arranged for my anesthesiologist to get who was the photographer, to get a jeep and a sergeant to take him down there, and he arrived. Of course, the Germans had departed. And they had nowhere to go. I assumed that they probably scattered in desertion and got out of their attire and assumed the appearance of German farmers. I don't know any other way of escape. They couldn't cross the river. The commanding officer of this cavalry unit had the German farmers in that area all brought in, and he commanded them to dig proper graves and bury each of these men decently. And this friend of mine had a picture of that along with the bodies. And he was ordered, whether carried out or not, that those people were responsible for keeping up that cemetery as long as they lived. Otherwise, they'd be punished as what they undoubtedly were permitting. Of course, they had no say-so. They may have been not anxious to have that, but it was providing food for the army, and they had agreed to it. This individual, when interrogated by one of the cavalry officers, complained of having a series of severe bouts of abdominal pain in his last few days or weeks there. So he sent him over to our hospital, and I immediately saw him. You could tell he was a human being, but his appearance was more that of a skeleton that had been encased in a leather outer coat. I doubt if he weighed much over 60 or 70 pounds. He had no flesh that you could detect between the hard leathery skin and his bones. He was very feeble. His eyes were owl-like in appearance because of the burning up of malnourished fat surrounding the eyeball, so he had a grotesque figure. But I was delighted to find that he spoke English. And so we found that the cause of his trouble was a gallstone in his gallbladder that was intermittently obstructing the outlet of the gallbladder, and when it filled up, it would push the stone down, and then when it accumulated enough bile back of it, well, the stone would dislodge itself back into the gallbladder. And of course, he was no candidate for surgery at that time, but we had the medical officer in charge take him over and supervise restoration of his health insofar as he could, with transfusions, vitamins, and appropriate diet. So after about a week, I removed his gallbladder, which was a very simple procedure because he had nothing between the skin hardly down to it. And he continued under the good care of the physician officer and made an uneventful recovery. But I took advantage of the opportunity of talking with him a lot. And it turned out that he had been a professor in a university in a small town in Poland. And I never asked him, but I never suspected that he was of Jewish descent. He didn't appear to be, had no features that would resemble that. And he told me, and that's one thing I could never forget, the most heinous act in the war, as far as I was concerned, that after Poland had surrendered, within a few days, SS troops came through the town with blaring sirens and stopping at short intervals to announce over a loudspeaker that all residents were obliged to return to their residence and remain indoors until they received further orders, and in any attempt to come out of doors, they would be immediately shot. He had a family consisting of a wife and 2 small girls. And after several days, one morning, they heard gunfire in the vicinity. And in a short time, there came a loud knock at the door for him and his family to come out and stand on the sidewalk in front of their house. And they noticed a number of canopied German trucks on the street. And shortly after they were placed in single file there, they were approached by a couple of officers who came in front of them, and 2 enlisted men who came in behind them. And one of the officers interrogated the man as to his occupation, health, felt his musculature, and finally said "Goot." And at that point, 2 other enlisted men escorted him out and put him in a truck. And next examined the wife, who apparently was a rather delicate lady, and very quickly said, "Kinda goot," whereupon she was immediately shot in the back of the head by one of the men behind her and fell forward. And he looked at the 2 little girls and said, "Zu kleine," and they were shot. And they were tossed aboard one of these canopied trucks like a piece of cordwood, 2 men with a man at each end, and they were thrown in there. And he was taken off in a truck with men that were considered to be suitable for some form of employment by the Reich. And he went through a series of these labor camps and had been at that particular one for about a year. And he said the mortality rate there was extremely high, that almost 2 or 3 times on morning roll call that they would haul off a corpse, probably burn it. I never knew what their fate was, but they were promptly replaced by other healthy captives. But in time, all of them would probably meet the same fate. And he miraculously managed to maintain his life. I imagine he learned how, with his intelligence, to steal a little produce as he went along and bring it in and eat it at night, and thereby stay alive. I always regretted that I never had my friend take a photograph of this man, and I don't know his fate. At the time of his recovery, he was removed and sent to a center for handling misplaced personnel. I don't know where he was sent or what happened to him thereafter. But that was, I cite that as an example of the atrocities that the Germans did commit. And it infuriates me every now and then to run across an article in some periodical where some extremist announces that all of the remarks about the German atrocities was just hogwash, and that the Germans did not commit such acts, but they did. And there were some good Germans. We heard of innumerable instances in which they acted very humanely. met a man after the war who had served in the battle for Cherbourg. He was with the 90th Division. And in an attack one morning, he was mowed down by machine gun fire. And he was near the German lines, and two German aid men came out to him with their white vests on and carried him into their hospital back in the woods, which consisted only of a small tarpaulin stretched between some trees, and in command of a lady. He didn't know whether she was a member of the army or a civilian nurse or a doctor. But at any rate, as soon as she examined him, she announced that this man couldn't live without blood. They had no blood and had never been supplied with any blood in their aid stations, and that he needed attention if he was going to live. So she sent one of these aid men out with a white flag over to the American lines, and told the interrogator that they had this man there that needed immediate attention, and that they would gladly exchange him for any type of German prisoner, whether he was a wounded patient or an active prisoner of war. So they immediately sent a German that had been captured back over, and in return got this man and evacuated him to a field hospital, and he was given emergency treatment there. His abdominal wound was handled, and he had extensive damage to one of his legs and several other extremity wounds, and was transferred from there to an evacuation hospital and eventually to England, and made a good recovery. Still has a limp and still has to had to undergo further surgery as a veteran for that, but I cite that as an example of the fact that there were some, and probably many, very humane Germans. I always liked the Germans prior to the war. I roomed with one year. Yes, when I was working on a fellowship. He was a delightful fellow. And while I was rooming with him, the German naval training vessel, I forget the name of it, which was equivalent to the one we have at Annapolis for training, selected young naval officers docked at Boston Harbor, and he made contact with them and invited me to go out with him with some of these fellows to the German Turnverein, which is similar to a YMCA, and we went out there and they sang German songs and gave us souvenirs, and very affable, decent chaps. And yet I don't know what they eventually did. They probably sometime or another killed some of our people, and we probably killed some of them later. But there's much we don't know yet about that war.
What campus were you with that fellow as your roommate? Was that at Harvard?
Yes, that's I was at the Massachusetts General Hospital at that time on a fellowship.
Can you tell me some more of your training?
Yes, I graduated at the University of Georgia and majored in zoology. I was quite interested in cytology and would be very interested in the work that those fellows are doing now. And I planned to make it my career, but in order to do so, I would have to have interned as a pathologist, and that didn't appeal to me very much because the first-year pathologist was primarily an assistant at autopsies and preparing tissues removed at surgery and at autopsies, which I was not particularly interested in. And I had an occasion to fill in for one of the younger interns who was a Swede and was granted a 2 or 3 weeks leave of absence to return to Sweden to marry and bring his wife back. So I filled in as a surgical intern, and I became very interested in surgery at that time and decided that I'd be happier there than doing laboratory work. And as a result, I went on and completed my residency at the end of 4 years at the Massachusetts General, and following that, and I married a fine young lady who came from a small New England town adjacent to Boston, and we returned to Athens with a young son in 1939, and I entered private practice here and practiced. I think at that time there were 13 doctors in Athens, and I became associated, but not officially, with the one well-trained surgeon in Athens who had his training at Jefferson in his internship, at George Washington Medical College, and had interned in New York a year with a German hospital, so he was a good surgeon. Of course, he was out of date and limited his surgery to the type of surgery that he did in his training, and as a result, I would do thyroidectomies for him and gastrectomies and things like that. He had no compunction about undertaking something that he was not trained in doing. But unfortunately, he died very shortly after I returned from the war, and he had served for many years as a consulting physician to the university. So I assumed that job, which was an added chore, and as the university grew, about, I guess, 4 years after I was there, this was after the war and this man's death, well, about 2 years, I guess, another Harvard graduate who came from Athens, who's already lined up with you, was a brilliant boy, and also attended Harvard and had a good training and served in a general hospital. So it wasn't long. His father was a professor of history at the university, and he was...
My guess is Dr. Irwin?
No, Dr. Irwin was a physician. And
who are you just referring to?
This is Dr. McPherson.
Of course.
John McPherson. And John called me last night and told me to brief him tonight on what the interview would consist of, as I told you before about the proper attire. But he took over that job at the university and continued with it until, I guess, for several years, and then they finally got when they got the new building there, a larger operation, they got a full-time man, and of course now there are several doctors that work there. But John was dedicated to the university because of his father's association there, and was a very fine man to work with, and I'm sure he'll give you a good interview. But I was glad to get out of the job. I did get one bonus while I was there. Just before the war, the doctor in Athens was physician for the football team, and he had been in the I guess he'd been in the National Guard. But anyway, he was called up quite early and went to the Pacific, and I filled in at his job as a team surgeon for a few months, and as a reward for that, Georgia played in the Orange Bowl that year and won the first Orange Bowl victory. I remember that occasion very well, but I still didn't enjoy much working at the university. There's no pay to it, one thing, and a young physician in those days needed it. A large portion of our work was charity then. There were no hospitals in any of these small surrounding towns. Some of them had very capable general practitioners who made excellent diagnoses and sent patients in to us, but the bulk of the practice, I wouldn't say the bulk, but a high percentage of it was charity, and 2 or 3 of us got together and organized a state cancer clinic at the General Hospital, and there again the work was all charity, and it was very successful, and I enjoyed working with those people. There were several of the doctors on the staff that participated in that program, and I became interested in my last years in practice. We enlarged our group. Well, first of all, several of us organized the medical center here, and Dr. Irwin and I did quite a bit of recruiting, getting board certified men interested in coming to Athens. We got a very good orthopedist and Dr. Boyle here, and his father was a friend of mine, and he organized a fine clinic here, and we got several good men in that way. And my last 2 years I did a lot of work with Dr. Harry O'Rear, who was dean of the medical school, but was on the state board of regents, and we were quite interested in establishing a nursing school similar to one that had been in existence at the Mass General in Boston in conjunction with Simmons College, which is a rather small but very good school educationally, whereby a girl could attend Simmons and take particular courses and also spend a certain amount of time in the training school for nurses at the hospital, and they made excellent nurses, and upon their graduation many of them stayed on at the hospital. Some of them returned to their homes with their degrees and probably worked very well in their hospitals. We ran into a lot of obstacles, and it was not until after I retired that they finally got it into the General. And the General, in the last, after it became, well, shortly before it became the regional hospital, greatly increased its staff and facilities, and on the last examination annual examination by the American Board of Hospital Accreditation, was rated 7th of hospitals of that size in the United States. So we have a very fine hospital. The hospital was originally built next door to my home on Prince Avenue, and I watched the construction of it. That may have had some reason I got interested in hospitals. But
And were you raised here in Athens?
Yes, I was raised right next door to where the hospital was. My grandfather bought 100 acres in, I think, 1980 there. That was, was a dirt road at the time. It was at the confluence of, before they made the change, of Cobb Street and Prince Avenue. And I can well remember when they paved Prince Avenue and put a fine streetcar line in. You could ride all day for a nickel. And on rainy days, instead of having to walk a mile and a half or ride a bicycle to school, which was down where the Coca-Cola company is now. Both the grammar school I attended was just opposite, and the high school on the opposite side. I either had to skate or ride a bicycle or walk. Rainy days, I'd go on the streetcar. But he divided that property up into 4 lots. He had 4 sons, and he planned to divide it into 5, but one of his sons wanted to live in their family home down on Prince Avenue, so 3 of his sons lived in a row there. One of their homes has been converted into the outpatient surgical clinic. The original home of another brother is still occupied by the widow of my first cousin, and she has a beautiful home that her husband's mother was from Baltimore, and furnished it very nicely. My grandfather's house deteriorated after his death. My father died quite early, and all of us scattered out. So my mother sold it and moved into a small cottage out off a village. So I've really had a good life. I can't complain about it.
And is your wife still alive?
That's the great tragedy of my life. We were very similar in our likes and dislikes, and we both were outdoors people. And my ambition was to retire to the mountains, which we did. And we had a little farm in western North Carolina and lived up there 15 years. She was a victim of inner ear deafness at a fairly early age and became almost totally deaf. And a little over 3 years ago, she developed Alzheimer's. And that's where I go twice a day out to the hospital here to see her. It's the most damnable disease in existence, I think. It's just horrible.
Where is she? Did you visit?
The Heritage. She has done well there, we think, and mostly as a result of understanding nursing care. They know how to handle those patients, and I can't handle her. And yesterday that meeting ran over time, and I came with Goodlow, and I had to go home with him. I couldn't leave early, and accordingly I missed my midday visit. And the nurses got on me last night when I went down.
I'll try to make sure you make it. I'll just ask 1 or 2 more questions this time.
All right. I've got plenty of time.
Well, would you tell me about your children quickly?
Yeah, I have 3 children. One, a son born in Boston who graduated from the law school at Georgia and went into law practice in Atlanta, and soon found out that he didn't enjoy corporate law, and he formed a small group and practiced general law. And he became very active in the First Presbyterian Church over there, and was an elder in the church, and recently was offered a scholarship to go to the Presbyterian Seminary, and he's debating about it. He says he thinks he's too old to go back to school, but his ambition is to do that, and his wife is a very fine musician. In fact, I'm not bragging about my children, but I'm stating it factually. His wife is the chairman of the talent board for the Metropolitan, and they hold auditions on people, and they've had several people from Georgia, 2 black voices that have done very well with the Met. And she was for many years the director of, I doubt if you're familiar with it, but they have this little town in the mountains of North Carolina named Brevard, and they have a music festival school up there in the summer. A lot of the talent from the music department of the university teach up there in the summer, and it's one of the most delightful little towns. It reminds me very much of the neat little New England towns where you never saw any quick food stores, advertisements, billboards on the street. People have small homes and they're kept neatly. And I met with an old friend of mine who was very prominent and highly respected at the university. You may or may not know him, Mr. J.W. Fanning. And he's a brilliant man, and he and I became very good friends. And I wasn't aware of him living in Athens. I thought after his wife's death he lived out of Athens. And upon learning that he lived in my neighborhood, so I promptly arranged to spend an afternoon with him, and he was asking me about my kids, and I told him, and he said, "Tell him to go after it." Said, "I don't know how many men that have done well by taking up a second profession late in life," and said, "If that's what he likes, make him do it."
And the other children?
And my second child is a daughter, and she graduated from the school of the landscape school here, and took a job with a firm in Atlanta for a while, and then soon married. And her husband was from commerce, and his family had a large mill which went broke a few years ago, and a bank. And the bank did very well, but she never did like commerce, and always wanted to come back to Athens, and finally did. And they found a nice home that was built by a couple who are good friends of ours in our old neighborhood. And his father stipulated that upon his death he wanted his son to sell his house to someone who would appreciate their home. And the home was in pretty bad disrepair, but they fixed it up, and they made attached a small studio on the garage, which she will occupy for many years. And I live out there. I'm very comfortable and happy out there. My youngest son was the brightest of the family, and well, my older son served in the after the war in the Judge Advocate General's Department in the Strategic Air Force, and stayed up in Alaska for 3 years, and had a wonderful time. I visited him twice up there. And he has a lot of my faults, one being an outdoorsman and loving trout and fly fishing. So he's very happy to go up to Brevard. The youngest son is studied art at the University of North Carolina, and he became the director of creative arts in one of the advertising firms in Atlanta. And I think, as I mentioned to you, he is really in TV work now, and has been very happy in it, but I don't think he likes it as much now as he did originally. And he's out of town so much with it, and he has 2 small children. But I guess he'll stick it out.
Let me take you back to World War II. You mentioned the nursing home, and I wanted to ask you about the quality of nursing.
Oh, it was excellent, excellent. We, it was like any organization, there were a few bad eggs, but our first nurse has an interesting story. She wanted to become a military nurse. She already had a degree in nursing, and she came from Toccoa, Georgia. And she entered the nursing corps and served in the campaign in North Africa, and then came back to England and joined, was assigned to one of the surgical auxiliary teams, and we happened to have her for our nurse. And she was a perfect lady and an excellent nurse. And shortly after the landing strip was attached, a strange fighter plane landed on the airstrip, and this young, I don't remember, it was a lieutenant or captain, came off, and it was her fiance. And later in the war, she was granted to leave and got married. And she was given a long weekend. They were married in the little French town of Treviers, which is about 15 miles north of Saint-Lô. And she was a wonderful nurse and very talented and conscientious. And oh man, it was when we were waiting transfer, and I'd transferred out of my outfit. We were stationed in Nancy, and she announced to us that she was pregnant. And of course she was discharged. We got, I'd separated from my original team at that time, and I fortunately got a very nice, excellent nurse. And I think my companion surgeon who stayed with the outfit also got a nice one. I wasn't successful in locating her till sometime after the war. I learned from a doctor from Toccoa that she was associated with a hospital there, so I called her and learned for the first time that her husband was killed in combat about 2 months after they married, and she had a son. And she said she didn't want to talk about the war. She was very interested in knowing about my health and my companion's health. And several years later, invited her to join my wife and daughter and have lunch with us up in Clarksville. There's a nice little restaurant, and she had retired then, and she still didn't want to mention the war. But her son turned out to be a very brilliant boy and has a good job in what they call it, Silicon Valley in New York, was one of the large corporations, and it's turned out to be a good son. He comes to see her very frequently, and she is aged, but last time I saw her, I've seen her 2 or 3 times. And I've never brought up the subject of the war with her, and listened to her stories about her son's achievements, so she's turned out to have a good life too. But the nurses were, for the greater part, very carefully selected for those jobs. They were very demanding, and the nurse I had, who was our second one, I never saw anybody that could work as hard. One place we were very busy, and we worked, I don't know, some 16 or 18 hours consecutively in the operating room. And after breakfast that morning, we got some coffee, and we decided to take an hour or 2 off. We were beginning to, fatigue was beginning to show on us. I had one patient I was particularly worried about, and he kept worrying me, and about 10 o'clock that morning, 9:30, I went over to see him. Damn, she wasn't still working, getting instruments and things cleaned up and ready to go. And I never saw such a hard worker. She developed right at the end of the war. We were at that last station. She developed a severe form of acne, I think, from tension. And she was sent back to England to a hospital there. But they were high quality girls. They were well selected, and the majority of them were very dedicated. I don't know of anyone that was dismissed from either one of the units that I was with. There were some of them that indulged in nocturnal misbehavior, but nobody paid any attention to it, particularly since Eisenhower did the same thing. And they were never called up or reprimanded. But by and large, they were pretty much in the category with these corpsmen as far as their contribution. They loved their patients and visited them after they were operated on. And they were deserved high honors. But I guess they were like Andy Arnbull, my friend I told you about, who had this terrific experience with the Rangers. I went out to see him one afternoon, and his wife had been a nurse for me when I was in practice in Athens. That was how I got to know him. She was the best nurse I ever had in Athens. And that was how I met Andy after I moved back to Athens. So she said, "Come on in, I want to show you some of my homes." And we're very pleased with it. So I'm going to show you Andy's den. And den was a library primarily, and he had a framed display of his awards, and a picture was smaller than that, and I looked at it, and I said, "Where are your medals?" I see your various unit patches, and see your ribbons for various campaigns, but I would expect you to have it covered with medals. He said, "No, I never got one." Said the Rangers were always told that when they did anything they did, that's why they were Rangers. But what they did was nothing exceptional for a Ranger. As a result, none of them ever received awards. That made me mad. And I ran into one of my colleagues in New York, in Boston, no, New York, shortly after the war, and he had been an Air Force surgeon in England during the war, and he had as much, as we used to call it, French salad on his chest as Patton had almost. And he'd never been in combat or anything. Every time his squadron had a successful raid, they would get an award for it, and they came out of the Army with all sorts of awards, and I think, as far as I know, the auxiliary teams were expected to do their job too. Two of my friends, one of them was my former companion, both were awarded Silver Stars for going into Bastogne on Christmas night. And they just had worlds of casualties and practically no doctors there. One of them went in on Christmas in a small plane carrying blood, and happened to be at our headquarters when they were told that this little plane had room for a passenger if they had a doctor that they could send, and so he went. And he said he couldn't do any more than a corpsman, that they had no supplies. They did have morphine and some dressings, but for doing anything major, he really didn't accomplish much. But of course that was a pretty dangerous mission, and he was awarded a Silver Star. And another man from our group who was a classmate of mine in medical school and had established the blood bank there, and he learned that they were going to send a load of blood into Bastogne by glider, and he volunteered to go and help set up their blood bank there. And he went in, and he said it was very terrifying coming down to the glider. I don't know how they were going to land, and he too got a Silver Star. But Luther Wolf, who was with the 2nd Auxiliary, the one I told you that wrote the records up and wrote a very fine diary. They were allowed to keep diaries. We were forbidden to. We could keep operative notes, but I lost mine. I didn't keep them very well anyhow.
You could keep operating notes, but you could not keep a diary.
No. In the First Army you could. I learned later that you could in the 2nd. Luther kept one the whole way through the war, and his commanding officer knew it. And that was one reason why he was designated to head up the team to write their history. He was awarded a medal that was given for outstanding non-combatant service, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Distinguished Medal was for exceptional bravery. I have one man lined up, the one I told you about, was awarded it. But the Air Force got them all. I don't know about the Navy.
How many other doctors served with you at a hospital like the Elbe River or
well,
field hospital?
There were 25 teams per unit, and we were originally assigned to one. We were under what was called Corps. That was entirely a headquarters organization in the Army that was in charge of one or more divisions. And of course there was only 2 divisions at the time of the invasion. There was the 5th Division on Omaha, and I think it was the 7th Division, which consisted only of one division, the 4th Division at Utah. But as more divisions came in, each corps required more divisions, so that some of them probably contained as many as 4 and 5 divisions. And we were more widely scattered to different outfits. I don't remember how many different outfits. I was fortunate in staying with, I thought, contrary to my friend, being assigned as long as I was to the 29th Division. I liked it. And I served with it in the 10th Armored Division in the campaign for Metz. And also, it was the 29th then, but it was changed to the 17th Corps when we went to Brest, but I was still with the 29th then. And I worked short periods. I was also sent with a one other team to Fiasco Montgomery's. I think you probably conceived this wild notion to try to regain his prestige for the failure of his earlier attempt to cross the Rhine, and it was a disaster, so-called market garden, and he came up with the idea of having a combined American and British airborne crossing on the lower Rhine, and we were sent up, 2 teams of us were sent up, supposedly, secretly, but obviously not, to a hospital and a monastery overlooking the Rhine at that point. It was a valley below, and we were there where we could see the paratroopers and the gliders go in and see them fall, and it was a sad sight to see. One of the gliders carried the team from the unit that I was with when we were assigned to the French Armored Division, and 2 of the members, one of mine was a very dear friend from medical school, and while we were in England we spent a lot of time together. The other was the man that had served in the Spanish Civil War. They were both killed, I would say murdered. They went in and landed, their glider landed very smoothly on a field on the opposite bank of the Rhine. It was a pure white glider and covered with red crosses. And after they landed and opened the door, there was a German machine gunner that mowed them down as they came off. And they killed the 2 surgeons, and fortunately just wounded the anesthesiologist, and he was sent back to this combined British-American hospital where I was, and brought me the wedding ring from my friend. It was covered with blood, which was a source of great sorrow to carry back to Boston to his wife. And I think they killed one of their medical technicians. The anesthesiologist was the only one that came back to the hospital. But we saw that plane after we crossed, after the airborne mission was over, the casualties from it. We had a number of casualties there. We had one incident that was very funny. We probably couldn't broadcast it, but I'll have to tell it to you. The team that I went up there with, the senior surgeon was a red-headed Irishman, a damn good surgeon and fine fella, but he was tough. And he was operating on a fellow that badly wounded, and someone came in from the office and told him when he was about halfway through this case that they wanted him to come immediately to such and such a field hospital, and he said, "I'll go and I get through this case." About 30 minutes later, a lieutenant colonel came over, and he came in the operating room, got a mask, and came in and told this man he was going to order him directly to come, and if he wasn't, he was going to prefer charges against him. Said, "I'm a doctor. I'm not a soldier." And said, "I don't give a damn if you do, but I'm going to finish operating on this man." And I came in a little later. He was dealing with a huge wound on this man's buttock. And I said, "Good God, Dave, what are you doing?" And his assistant spoke up. And he said, "Oh, this is that lieutenant colonel whose ass Dave chewed out a while ago. He felt sorry for him and was repairing it." I thought it was very amusing, but Dave stuck by and he finished his case and then left. But he was determined he wasn't going to leave that patient, and he was right. And I think any military court would have upheld him. But I didn't like lieutenant colonels as a whole. Most of them had gained their rank purely on a basis of longevity. They hadn't been in the Army so long, and it seems like the one that I always seemed to have trouble with were feisty little lieutenant colonels that I always call pissant colonels. I had several instances with them that were just ridiculous. Our parting instructions when we left the ship to come ashore at Normandy was to immediately dig a foxhole. And one of the brasher members of the team group, more outspoken, said, "What the hell are we going to dig them with? We don't have any entrenching tools." And he said, "Dig them with your helmet." And that beach at Normandy was mostly densely packed gravel, and you could spend a day digging a foxhole. But that was how much some of them knew, and I had a run-in with another one. I'd had a foot injury many years earlier, which I tore a ligament on the sole of my foot, and as a result, I developed a tendency to list to one side, and we had an excellent orthopedic shop at Lawson, and I went there, and the man in charge of it, who was a civilian, got the chief of orthopedics to prescribe correction to keep me from getting tired from prolonged standing, and he put a corrective heel on it. And after I found I was going overseas, I bought myself a new pair of shoes and soaked them in leather in neat's foot oil for a night to make them soft and durable, and got him to correct the heel, and at our last shakedown, this little pissant colonel made me throw them out because they were not regulation. And I said, "What the hell has that got to do with it?" And he said, "Well, your soles are leather, and that's more inflammable than the composition." I said, "I don't expect to walk on hot coals anywhere." He said, "You take them up there, and I'm going to see that you put those shoes in a garbage can and buy you, send to the PX and get you another pair of regular GI shoes." I could have bashed his face in. I think everybody had a lot of funny experiences to relate, some good, some bad. I know I've taken up too much of your time.
You have not. Can you tell me briefly about returning home?
Yeah, it was a long journey. Our unit was supposed to go to Okinawa, so we went by slow train from northeast Germany to a little town. I forget the name of it now. It was where Monet, the famous painter, lived, a few miles out of Marseille. And we stayed there for several weeks until we were alerted to go. And my friend there, who had been a good friend of mine of Lawson, he and I went down, got our heads shaved preparatory preparation to go. And in the meantime, they had a congressional investigation of the excessive number of doctors in service when they had a shortage of them in America. So they passed a ruling that on the basis of campaign points and military points that you'd be sent back to the States. Unfortunately, I'd acquired enough points, and it was just a leapfrog affair from my plane from one hospital where you'd spend 2 or 3 days till your name got put up on the bulletin board until you finally got the big port at Glasgow, Prestwick, at Glasgow, Scotland, and we flew back quite uneventfully. One of my hospital colleagues had been assigned to a hospital in Wales as chief of surgery, the general hospital there, and he became acquainted with the Bushnell family. And when he left, one of the Bushnells gave him a case of Bushnell's Irish liqueur, and there were strict orders as to what you could carry back, and you were allowed to carry back 2 bottles of whiskey. And he gave a bottle to various friends, but he still had an excess amount, and gave me a couple of bottles, and we still had one extra, so we consumed it that night, and in pretty bad shape when we entered the plane the next morning. We came back by Greenland and Newfoundland and back to New York. And I had very good luck there. I had a brother, my elder brother was still working in New York.
Excuse me, one moment. I'm sorry, I just wanted to tell you that we could be just 5 or 10 minutes more.
So we got a pass for a couple of days to visit with him in New York before I was sent to Augusta, which was a discharge station. And I came back. The process of being discharged required several days, and I came back on the bus and drove my wife's car back down the next day. And as I turned onto the Augusta Highway out at the end of Village, I saw a sergeant standing there with a handbag, so I stopped and asked him if he was going to Augusta, and he said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm going." I said, "Well, hop in, I'll take you down." So we began to talk and found out that he worked in the discharge center. He said, "You anxious to get out?" And I said, "Yeah, I sure am." He said, "I'll have you out of here." It was on a Saturday morning. Said, "I'll have you out of here by noontime." And he went to every department I had to go to and always gave whoever was in charge of it the message that I was an important party that the general wanted to have the discharge expedited. So at noontime he and I came back to Athens. Otherwise we would spend another week down there. I had a lot of good luck. I immediately went back to practice after I got home and stayed pretty busy. I got reacquainted with my youngest son.
How old were they?
Let's see, he was born in December of the first year I was overseas, so he was about a year and a half old. This was in the summer. When I got back, he would have been 2 in December.
You've been away for how long?
Overseas,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I was altogether about 18 months.
If you were summing up that point in history for young people, tends to be the last question I ask. If you were speaking to younger people about what you lived through during that time, the World War II era, what's the most important thought you'd leave them with? How would you say?
Well, I guess it depends on what they had to offer, but as I mentioned earlier, I felt that a young, pretty tough physically, as I was then, surgeon was obligated. I think we owed it to the fellows who were getting killed. I don't approve of war at all. And I would advise anybody that was endangered, if they felt that they could advantageously improve their assignment by promptly learning who to become acquainted with and get an assignment that was suitable for them, where they could perform at them as near as possible to a suitable profession. I had one cousin who had a very sad life, as he was born an orphan and was reared by an RN practically, who did extremely well in college, and I don't know whether he had any choice in it, but at any rate he was assigned to headquarters of the Army in Italy, and worked in the Judge Advocate General's office there. And he promptly came back and got a fine job, which he ended up as treasurer and vice president of the Georgia Pacific firm. So he had a very profitable experience in the war. Of course, my eldest son had a good experience too, because he was, I don't think he had any choice. He was immediately assigned to the Judge Adjutant General's office and worked with his commanding officer there was a very fine lawyer, and he learned a great deal while he was there, and was able to get off to a good start when he got back. My youngest son applied for the Naval Air Force. He was a student at the University of North Carolina at the time, and on his physical examination they found he had a minor defect in one of his eyes, which he wasn't aware of, and I don't think it caused him any trouble. But as a result, he was not admitted to flight school and was assigned to a headquarters job and was a pen pusher his experience, which he despised, which he got very much out of that.
Well, anything you'd say to your grandchildren about those times?
Well, for some reason, my youngest son has been more interested in my involvement in the war, and the older son, I guess it was because the older son was more interested in the fact that he was able to follow his profession, but he was in a position, as I may have mentioned, that for quite a while his office was next door to the government printing press in Atlanta, and he became friends with one of the men over there and helped establish a very good library for me of periodicals and whatnot. I've only kept the ones that I was particularly concerned with. Now that we have this heritage room, I wish I'd kept everything. But I did a lot of work after I retired in genealogy and many small community libraries here and there, and as a result, when I would leave that, I'd always give them a number of books. I felt obligated to do so. I knew that they would be a burden upon my demise for disposing of a lot of them. So I live on the bare essentials now. I've got a small couple of rows of books such as this and whatnot.
What year did you retire?
The latter part, middle of 1969, which was a little early in view of the change in the profession economically. Oh, I heartily disapprove of it. I would have been better off perhaps to have stayed in a little longer, but I determined, along with two of my older friends, one of whom was my idol as an expert surgeon, one day when I was a resident, we were in the dressing room, dressing after surgery, and the senior surgeon told the two of us, the other was ahead of me, and he told us that I really had a bad experience this morning, so I had to go in and bail old Dr. X out of a mess he'd gotten in. Said he had no business operating, and said I had firmly resolved that when I reach the age of 60, I'm not going to operate anymore. And he had a right sad life. His wife had one of those chronic diseases. Which one was it? It wasn't Parkinson's, but it was similar to that. And he had no children. But he did retire at age 60 and moved to Vermont. And I can't understand why, because he was a very active man physically. He had no bad habits, didn't smoke or anything, but he died suddenly about a year after he retired. Heart attack. The second member is still living and reasonably well. He's retired in Florida. We keep up a close correspondence. We don't see each other anymore, but we talk over the phone from time to time and exchange books and whatnot. And I still feel that a general surgeon should retire while he feels perfectly at ease operating. I think after you reach a certain age, particularly in our times, we didn't have the, and I don't believe it would influence because of my agreement, but prior to that, the staff members had to cover the emergency room. and which meant that, of course, I had the advantage of alternating with my associates, but nevertheless, you frequently have to go to the hospital at night and stay up patching up a bunch of bums from an automobile accident, and then have a hard case to do the next morning with bleary eyes and tired and all. And I still think I would advise a young man, a general surgeon, to retire at around 60. And of course, what they make these days, they can very easily do it and live happily ever afterwards. But I don't begrudge them.
In your retirement, where was your farm in western North Carolina? Was it
No, it wasn't. I wish I'd been in the Brevard. On the outskirts of it. I retired just in the backwoods between Franklin and Murphy. And we were well off the beaten path. And I bought 12 acres of land, about half of it, or a third of it, I'd say, was just prime bottom land with a creek flowing through it. And we built on a projection out from a much higher ridge, but we had a magnificent view of the Smokies from our front porch. My wife was particularly interested always in flowers and landscape work, and frequently would go trout fishing with me. And we really couldn't have spent a more idyllic life than we did. We were both very happy there. I had about 2 acres under cultivation. We grew grapes, and all types of fruits, pears, cherries, apples, and boasted of having in our garden everything from asparagus to zucchini. And it was a hell of a nice life. We had a small, well-insulated cottage, and although we had a heat pump, we utilized a large, heavy iron wood stove in our living room that completely heated the house. We had a small stove on our sun porch for them to sit out there in the winter. But the only time we ever used heat was when the children would come up and have some youngsters with them and would close the doors to their room at night and wouldn't get the benefit of the heat from the stove, and we'd turn the air conditioning on then. But we really had a fine time. I wouldn't want to have lived anywhere else.
Well, I'm glad you moved back to Athens.
What's that?
I'm glad you moved back to Athens.
I'm very happy here. We, I may have told you, we live just around the corner from the home we built when I came back from the war. And at that time, we built on that whole road that road then was known as the Alps. And it was a dirt road, and we were the first house out there. I had 2 acres and was able to raise my setter dogs and have a rifle range down on the side, and we had a nice life there. But after the children all married and moved out, why, it wasn't a big house. A pretentious house. It was very comfortable, but it was more than we needed. And besides, we wanted to go to the mountains, so we sold it and moved out. I started to say I bought that house and lot in Hayesville, I guess in '72. We lived, Dr. Harris from Athens and I bought a 2-story log cabin years before we retired up on the Chattahoochee River, and we winterized it so that we could utilize it and even take our families up there in the wintertime when we went deer hunting or grouse hunting. But as the children grew up, they wanted to get on the lake. And we felt like that we'd had our fun there and let them do what they wanted to, so we bought a cottage on Lake Burton and enjoyed it over there. But, well, it wasn't crowded then. We just had a small cottage, but we winterized it and spent one winter up there. And it was, along with 5 other houses, it was burned down by arsonists. And we decided we didn't want to, the place was growing, and we didn't like the people that had taken over the commercial boat dock on the cove there anyhow, and didn't trust them to leave for repairs or anything. And we didn't have space for a garden except just put up some tomato vines on the side of the cliff. So I was well pleased with the place we got in Burton. A young lady who bought the house from a friend of mine who at that time lived across the road, and because of ill health moved back to Athens. He was in the nursery business, and he sold it, his place, to a young couple that were interested in nurseries, and they've continued to have one. And one day I stopped by to see him, and she said, "I'm glad to see you and give you an update on your place." And I said, "What's happened to it?" And she said, "Well, you know your house was on the side of a very steep mountain." I said, "Yeah." I said, "You could hardly walk up the side of it." She said, "Well, the lots on that ridge now are selling for $90,000 a lot, and the ones on the top, 1-acre lots, are sold for $100,000.
This is still Lake Burton?
No, this is up there in the wilderness of Hayesville.
Hayesville, North Carolina?
Yeah. Imagine that, $100,000. And I'd paid $12,000 for 8 acres, and better than any of the plots up there. But I wouldn't want to live up there now, packed in like that.
Well, Dr. Talmadge, I'd like to bring this to a close. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it. As I say, old men like to talk, and
well, this is one way we can listen. And I'm really grateful you came to speak.
Well, if you find what I've said is not